It was a sound that should have been heard over the skies of Berlin in 1940, a high-pitched, terrifying scream that signaled not just a new machine, but a new era of physics. It was a sound that would have rendered the terrifying Stuka bombers obsolete, swatted the Luftwaffe from the air during the Battle of Britain, and potentially brought the Nazi war machine to a grinding halt years before the beaches of Normandy were ever stormed. But that sound was silenced, not by enemy action, not by a lack of resources, and not by sabotage. It was silenced by a polite letter written by men in comfortable offices who believed they knew the limits of possibility. They looked at the blueprints of the future. They looked at the mathematics that unlocked the speed of sound, and they laughed. They called it a fantasy. They called it impossible. And because of their laughter, the world burned for 5 more agonizing years. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we must go back to a time before the first shots were fired. The year is 1929. The location is a stuffy office within the British Air Ministry. A 22-year-old Royal Air Force officer named Frank Whittle is presenting an idea that sounds like madness. He is proposing a plane without a propeller. At this time, aviation is defined by the piston engine. Big, heavy blocks of metal turning wooden or metal blades, clawing through the air. It is a brute force method, and it has a ceiling. Every engineer in the world knows that you can only make a piston engine so powerful before it becomes too heavy to fly. They know that planes have a speed limit, somewhere around 400 miles per hour, before the physics of a propeller stop working. But Frank Whittle has found a loophole. He places a design on the desk for a gas turbine engine. It sucks in air, compresses it, ignites it, and blasts it out the back, using Newton's third law to push the aircraft forward with thrust rather than pull it with a propeller. It is elegant, it is simple, and it is theoretically capable of speeds that would make the fastest fighter planes of the day look like they are standing still. The officials at the Air Ministry consult their experts. These are the most respected aeronautical minds in the British Empire. They look at Whittle's calculations, and then they deliver their verdict. They tell the young officer that his gas turbine is impracticable. They argue that the metals required to withstand the heat do not exist. They argue that the fuel consumption would be so high the plane could never leave the airfield. They dismiss him. They do not just reject the idea. They treat it as a scientific curiosity with no military value. The official report states that the gas turbine engine will never be a viable power source for aircraft. Frank Whittle is undeterred, but he is broke. He patents the idea himself, paying the fee out of his own pocket. But without government funding, he cannot build a prototype. The patent sits in a drawer. The idea gathers dust. For 6 critical years, while Hitler rises to power while the factories of the Ruhr Valley begin to churn out tanks and guns, the weapon that could stop them is trapped on paper, ignored by the very people it was designed to save. This is the first great irony of the Second World War. The British had the key to total air superiority in their hands a full decade before the war began. Had the Air Ministry given Whittle even a fraction of the budget they spent on obsolete biplanes, the Royal Air Force could have fielded a squadron of jet fighters by 1939. Imagine the scenario. The Germans launched their blitzkrieg into Poland. They send their Heinkels and Dorniers to bomb Warsaw. And out of the clouds descends a flight of Gloucester meteors, flying 150 miles per hour, faster than anything the Germans possess. The psychological impact alone would have been devastating. The Luftwaffe would have been grounded. The Blitz of London would never have happened. But history is rarely that simple, and stupidity is rarely confined to one side of the border. While the British were laughing at Whittle, a young German physicist named Hans von Ohain was having a very similar idea. The difference was that von Ohain found a backer. He found Ernst Haenkel, a man who cared less about bureaucracy and more about speed. By August 1939, days before the invasion of Poland, the Germans actually flew a jet aircraft. The Heinkel He-178 took 2.
The skies. It was the first turbojet flight in history. The Germans had won the race. They had the technology. They had the proof. And then they made the exact same mistake as the British. When Heinkel presented this miracle to the German Air Ministry, the Luftwaffe leadership shrugged. They were winning the war with conventional weapons. Their Messerschmitt 109s were the best in the world. Why waste money on this noisy, fuel-guzzling toy? They told Heinkel to stop distracting them. They laughed at the jet engine, too. So, as the war exploded across Europe, the two most advanced nations on Earth both possessed the technology to end the conflict, and both locked it away in the cupboard. It is a testament to the inertia of military thinking. Generals always prepare to fight the last war, not the next one. They understood propellers. They understood pistons. They did not understand the jet stream. It wasn't until 1941 that the British finally woke up. The war was going poorly. They needed an edge. Whittle, who had been scraping by with private funding and running an engine in a derelict foundry, finally got a plane airborne, the Gloucester E-2839s. It flew. It was fast. It was smooth. The test pilot climbed out of the cockpit and reportedly said, "It was like being pushed by a giant hand." Suddenly, the laughter stopped. The Air Ministry panicked. They realized they had wasted a decade. They ordered the immediate production of a jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor, but you cannot buy back time. Developing a combat-ready aircraft takes years. The engines were temperamental. The pilots had to be retrained. The metallurgy was still catching up. While the British scrambled to correct their mistake, the Germans were doing the same. They had finally authorized the Messerschmitt Me 262. This was a shark of a plane. Swept wings, heavy cannons, and two Junkers jet engines that gave it a top speed of over 540 miles per hour. It was untouchable. American Mustangs and British Spitfires could only watch as the Me 262 zoomed past them, attacked the bombers, and vanished into the stratosphere before anyone could return fire. If the Me 262 had entered service in numbers in 1943, the Allied bombing campaign over Germany would have stopped. The D-Day invasion would have been impossible without air superiority. The war would have dragged on into 1946 or 1947, likely ending only when one side dropped an atomic bomb on a European city. But here, the narrative of rejection takes a darker, almost comical turn. The Me 262 was ready for mass production. The generals were ready to deploy it as a fighter to sweep the skies clear of Allied bombers. And then Adolf Hitler intervened. Hitler looked at this beautiful, sleek interceptor and saw something else. He didn't want a defensive weapon. He wanted to strike back at England. He ordered that the Me 262 be redesigned as a Schnell bomber, a fast bomber. The engineers were horrified. Hanging heavy bombs on a jet fighter ruined its aerodynamics. It added weight. It stressed the engines. It required a redesign of the fuselage. But no one said no to the Führer. The project was delayed by months. Critical, war-losing months. By the time the order was reversed and the Me 262 was allowed to fly as a fighter, the Allied armies were already on the German border. The fuel supplies were gone. The pilots were dead. The weapon that could have saved the Third Reich was wasted because a dictator wanted to use it for revenge rather than strategy. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the Gloucester Meteor finally entered service in July 1944. It was the Allies' first and only operational jet of the war. But the British were still paralyzed by caution. They were so terrified that the Germans might capture a crashed meteor and learn its secrets that they forbade the pilots from flying over enemy territory. Think about that. They had a weapon that could dominate the air, a weapon they had delayed for 10 years, and when they finally had it, they were too scared to use it. The Meteors were relegated to chasing V-1 flying bombs over the English Channel. They never dogfought the Me 262. They never cleared the skies over Berlin. They were a technological marvel kept on a leash. The story of the jet engine in World War II is not a story of triumph. It is a story of failure. It is a tragedy of missed opportunities. If Frank Whittle had been listened to in 1929, the Royal Air Force would have had jets in 1935. The political landscape of Europe would have been fundamentally different. A Germany facing a Britain armed with jet fighters might never have dared to invade Poland. The deterrent factor alone changes the calculus of history. But it wasn't just the jet engine. This pattern of ridicule and rejection plagued almost every major innovation of the war. Consider the highball bouncing bomb. We all know the story of the dam busters, the bouncing bombs that destroyed the German dams in the Ruhr Valley. That was Barnes-Wallace's triumph, but Wallace had another idea. He designed a smaller version of the bouncing bomb, called the highball. designed to be dropped by mosquito bombers to skip across the water and smash into the sides of ships. It was the perfect weapon against the Japanese Navy and the German Tirpitz. But the Admiralty and the RAF bickered over it. They delayed testing. They argued about which squadron should use it. They laughed at the idea of skipping a bomb like a stone on a pond to hit a battleship. By the time they finally decided to deploy it, the targets were already gone or destroyed by conventional means. A weapon that could have decimated the enemy fleet in 1942 was left to rot in warehouses or look at the American side. The sheer arrogance of the US military establishment regarding the bazooka and rocketry. Robert Goddard, the father of modern rocketry, was ridiculed by the New York Times and ignored by the US Army for decades. He offered his services in World War I and was dismissed. He offered them again as World War II approached. The Army was not interested. They liked artillery. They liked big guns. They didn't understand rockets. It was only when the Germans began raining V-2 rockets on London that the Americans realized they had made a mistake. They had to scramble to catch up, eventually importing captured German scientists, the very men who had used Goddard's own published papers to build their weapons to jumpstart the US space program. But the jet engine remains the most painful example because the technology was right there. It wasn't science fiction. It didn't require a Manhattan Project level of investment. It just required an open mind. There is a specific moment that captures this blindness perfectly. In 1940, a British scientific committee was reviewing the prospects of future propulsion. They wrote a memo discussing the gas turbine. In it, they estimated that the maximum power a gas turbine could ever produce would be less than the weight of the engine itself. In other words, they claimed it couldn't even lift its own weight off the ground. At the exact moment they were typing that memo, Frank Whittle's experimental engine was running on a test bench, producing more thrust than they claimed was mathematically possible. They were arguing with reality, and because they held the purse strings, reality had to wait. What is the cost of this laughter? How do we quantify it? We measure it in the duration of the war. If the Allies had fielded jets in 1941, the air war over Europe ends in 1942. The strategic bombing campaign becomes absolute. German industry is leveled with impunity. The U-boat pens are destroyed. The Eastern Front, where millions of Soviets and Germans died in a meat grinder, might have looked very different if the Luftwaffe had been erased from the map 2 years earlier. We are talking about millions of lives. Soldiers who died in the hedgerows of France, civilians who died in the concentration camps in the final chaotic years, pilots who burned to death in obsolete piston-engine aircraft. They paid the price for the skepticism of a few bureaucrats in the 1930s. The narrative of military history is often written as a march of progress. We like to think that the best technology wins, that the smartest ideas rise to the top. But the story of the jet engine proves otherwise. It proves that innovation is fragile. It proves that experts are often the biggest barrier to progress because they are too invested in the status quo. The experts knew that propellers were the only way to fly. The experts knew that you couldn't break the sound barrier. The experts knew that Frank Whittle was a dreamer. When the Gloucester Meteor finally flew combat missions, the pilots noted something eerie. The silence. In a piston plane, the vibration is constant. The noise is deafening. In the jet, there was a smooth, powerful hum. It felt like the future. But as they looked down at the ruins of Europe, in 1945, at the smoking cities and the endless graveyards, they must have wondered why that future had arrived so late. The war ended in May 1945. Frank Whittle was eventually knighted. He was called a hero. But in his private journals and later interviews, the bitterness was palpable. He knew what he had offered them. He knew that the blueprint for victory had been sitting on a desk in the Air Ministry since 1929, buried under a pile of rejection letters. They laughed at the weapon that could have saved the world, and in the end, the joke was on all of us. The lesson of the jet engine is not about aerodynamics. It is about the danger of the closed mind. When we face a crisis, whether it is a world war or a global challenge, the solution often looks like madness to the establishment. It looks like a toy. It looks impossible. But history teaches us that the impossible is usually just an engineering problem waiting for funding. The next time someone laughs at a radical new idea, remember the sound of the jet engine. Remember the silence of the skies in 1940, when they should have been screaming with the sound of freedom. And remember that the most dangerous weapon in any war is not the tank or the bomb or the gun. It is the refusal to see the future when it is staring you right in the face.